We're getting a closer look at the dramatic efforts to evacuate Afghans and other people from the war-torn country following the Taliban's swift takeover. Qatar is organizing evacuation flights, offering families lifelines out of Afghanistan's capital as the Taliban continues to strip basic freedoms from women, journalists, business owners, and regular citizens. Imtiaz Tyab has more from inside one of those flights leaving Kabul.
They consider themselves the lucky ones. Afghans, young and old, checking in for an evacuation flight, carrying with them just a few precious possessions as they take a chance at a new life abroad and away from the Taliban.
Just getting to this point for so many Afghans has been extraordinarily difficult, and now they have to take the next big step in their journey.
A journey into the unknown Nabi Roshan is taking with his young family. One of Afghanistan's most popular comedians, he hosted a nightly TV comedy show where no one, not even the Taliban, was off limits. But after it seized power in August, Roshan says there's little left to laugh about.
Do the Taliban like jokes?
I don't think.
You don't think so?
No.
Did you receive any threats?
Yeah. Oh. I don't know. Just said I will
kill you.
Maybe.
This evacuation flight is one of over a dozen that have been organized with meticulous precision by the government of Qatar. The tiny Persian Gulf kingdom has played an oversized role in helping more than 70,000 people flee from Afghanistan since the U.S. withdrawal nearly 2 months ago. It's in stark contrast to the chaos that followed immediately after the Taliban seized power and the desperate scenes of Afghans trying to flee, some losing their lives. In one of the many paradoxes of the new Afghanistan, also boarding this flight to the Qatari capital Doha are senior members of the Taliban government, including the interim foreign minister Amir Khan Muttaqi, who stopped to speak exclusively to CBS News in his first interview with the U.S. network.
Is the Taliban prepared to have full diplomatic relationship with the United States?
He says, "We want a positive relationship with the world, including the U.S., but we will not accept the military presence of any country. We only welcome diplomatic and economic ties."
There are so many Afghans on this flight who are leaving. What is your message to Afghans who want to leave?
If they want to leave, they can leave, he says. In our government, all Afghans, whether they agree or disagree with our policies, are free. But so many Afghans would rather the uncertainty of leaving than the supposed freedoms of the Taliban regime. Before departing for their final destinations in Europe, the US, and beyond, they are housed by the Qatari government in this temporary accommodation, where they're offered free housing, groceries, and other services, including a nursery where the youngest evacuees come to express themselves through coloring and play. It's where we reconnect with comedian Nabi Roshan and his family as they wait for the next step in their journey.
Nabi, how are you feeling?
This is good.
You're good?
Yeah, happy.
Happy?
Yeah.
I mean, your kids are here, they're enjoying?
Yeah, they're playing after 10 months.
Really? It's the first time you've seen them play?
Yeah.
That must be pretty special.
It is the God gift.
You must feel so much relief that you were here.
Yeah, I told you in Kabul, I want to go to take oxygen. Now I'm feeling oxygen in Qatar.
Nofel Swadi works for the government of Qatar and is head of operations here.
And what have Afghans who are here been saying to you?
You get connected to everyone that's here. You feel like you're such a part of everyone's story. It's also hard sometimes to hear what everyone has been through, to hear everyone's story. We're so glad that everyone's been so gracious. Everybody's been so, receptive of everything, and they've shown us in a lot of ways how much they appreciate everything.
Must be kind of humbling a little bit.
It is, definitely.
The gratitude of Afghans to Qatar is clear, but there is also a sadness being felt here. So many tell us they did not want to flee their homes. But as the Taliban tightens its grip on power, basic freedoms have already been stripped away, including barring most women from going to work, forbidding girls over the age of 12 from going to school, and locking minorities out from the interim government. After 20 years of war, the group, it seems, hasn't changed very much, which is why so many of Afghanistan's best and brightest are leaving.
And Imtiaz joins us now with more on all of this. Imtiaz, I followed your reporting all throughout the time that you were in Afghanistan. It was so powerful, so crucial, my friend. Thank you very much. Let's talk about why Afghans are choosing to leave for this uncertain future rather than live under Taliban rule. Because when you interviewed members of the Taliban, they say that everybody is welcome, everybody is going to be given the rights to live peacefully and securely, but that's clearly not the case.
Hey, Vlad, good to talk to you, and thank you very much. Yeah, look, it's obviously a very complicated situation on the ground in Afghanistan, a very uncertain situation on the ground in Afghanistan, but also a very scary one for so many Afghans, particularly those who worked with U.S. forces, were part of the now former Afghan government or part of the now former Afghan military. They're so desperate to leave this fear that they have that now that the Taliban are in power. But as you so rightly point out, the Taliban keep saying, listen, this is an Afghanistan for everyone. We are now the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. People will have freedoms. And yet we've seen very much the opposite. And again, so many of these people who we were speaking to at the airport as they prepared to board this flight, they were saying that they felt this sense of relief, but also this sense of heartbreak that they were leaving their country behind, their homeland behind, a place that they had for the last 20 years of U.S. involvement in which they believed they were building a government, building a civil society, building a free press, that all of that is now gone and that they have no choice but to leave. And they just don't believe those promises from the Taliban that they'll be safe. And we have we've seen a lot of anecdotal evidence of the Taliban threatening or indeed committing acts of violence against those who they say stood against them when they were effectively an insurgency group. And that threat alone is why so many people are leaving. Vlad.
You know, Imtiaz, we talk about journalists and, activists being targeted, but, here you have a comedian. And the Taliban before certainly has shown a level of intolerance when it came to art and expression. And he had good reason to fear for his life because there was a comedian that had been arrested by the Taliban even in July before the Taliban had officially taken over. And there was a video uploaded of him, and he did not survive.
Yeah, this is a really tragic case, as you rightly point out, just weeks before the Taliban seized power. In the south of the country, in their heartland, in Kandahar, which is where the birthplace of the Taliban was, there was a video of a comedian. His name was Nazar Mohammed, better known as Kasha Khan, or Zwan rather, and he was seen being taken into Taliban custody and then killed. Again, just weeks before the Taliban seized power, the Taliban said, yes, we did this. We killed this comedian. And this was a comedian who would post videos on TikTok where he would make fun of himself. He would do pranks. And yeah, some of his jokes would be against the Taliban. And when you think of the role comedians play in any society, including in Afghanistan, where they poke fun at some of the darkest aspects of society. When we met somebody like Nabi, who has very small children who we met in our piece, lovely kids, lovely family, he really did live in fear. In fact, he said that he received a number of phone calls, threatening phone calls, which he says was from the Taliban, and that they inferred that they would kill him. And so he had to leave everything behind, his home, his hopes of the future in Afghanistan, all of that gone. And that is why he got on that flight to a life of great uncertainty. He's a comedian. He speaks Pashto and Dari. He doesn't speak any other language. And how is he going to forge a life ahead? He doesn't have answers to those questions, but what he does know is that he, his children, they're now safe.
So, Afghanistan is in the midst of what the United Nations is calling the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. And Imtiaz and Anne-Marie, you guys know that that's saying a lot, because there are things happening in Ethiopia, there are things happening in Myanmar. This is so when the UN says this is the worst in the world, that suggests that it's really horrific. What did you witness there, Imtiaz, on the ground?
I mean, guys, it's staggering to see just how quickly and how rapidly Afghanistan has declined from a humanitarian point of view. We have to remember that as soon as the Taliban swept into power and the U.S. effectively ended its longest war, the international taps, if you will, were switched off. The U.S. froze $9 billion in assets that was earmarked for Afghanistan, but so too did other international institutions, and more importantly, aid organizations have found it increasingly difficult to bring aid into Afghanistan. And we also have to remember that despite 20 years of involvement, not only from the U.S., but indeed from the world and, places like the IMF and the World Bank and the International Monetary, or rather, and other international institutions, that Afghanistan's economy, 75% of it was aid dependent. That means that there wasn't an economy that could function on its own. And so when the international community left, this huge vacuum opened up. And that's why we're seeing these desperate scenes. We were at a food distribution center which was handing out food to some of the most desperate people in Afghanistan. And all they could offer people was sacks of flour and a bit of salt so that they could make some bread. And we were speaking to one of the men who was organizing it. It was a USAID-funded World Food Program organized facility. And he said, look, this isn't going to help them nutritionally, but it's going to fill their bellies. And that's all we can really do in this moment. And yet at the same time, and it really sort of just helps you to crystallize why so many people are afraid in Afghanistan, is while we were there, a group of Taliban fighters walked in, very heavily armed. And our producer, Mukhtar, who speaks the local language, overheard one of those fighters say, should we kill the foreigners? Us, our crew. We, of course, left immediately after hearing that. But it really sort of helps us really just understand the situation on the ground in Afghanistan. That as well as having this extraordinary humanitarian crisis where people are hungry, and of course it's always the youngest who are the most vulnerable to hunger, but there's also this threat of violence by the new rulers of this country. And that, I think, really is why the international community really struggles with how to help Afghanistan. On the one hand, they want to prevent this humanitarian crisis. They don't want to see the children dying of malnutrition in the way that we did when we visited one of the hospitals. In fact, aid agencies warning that up to 1 million children could die from starvation in Afghanistan. Nothing urgent is done. And yet the international community just doesn't know how to deal with this Taliban, which has promised to be new, which has promised to be different, which has promised to engage differently with its own people, and we just haven't seen them do that.
Imtiaz, you spoke to several Taliban leaders, including the interim foreign minister. What did they tell you about Afghanistan's many crises and the lack of faith that the Afghan people have in the Taliban's ability to manage any of this?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Anne-Marie. And, the short answer is the Taliban seems to have a lot of answers. They say, look, Afghanistan's a free country. The international community should engage with us. And yet at the same time, when we look at all the rights that have been eroded, whether it's women or girls, when we look at its failure to address any of the sort of meaningful humanitarian issues on the ground, when we look at its kind of inability to sort of engage with the world, mainly because of their own behavior in their own country, again, eroding rights, not making good on the promises that were made when they negotiated with the Trump administration in the Qatari capital, Doha, as part of the agreement which the Biden administration enacted which led to the end of America's longest war. When none of those things are happening, it's really hard to take the Taliban at face value. It's really hard for anyone, let alone the U.S. or indeed international bodies who are there to help and poised to help, to find a way forward. But the Taliban is insistent that, they are now the leaders of Afghanistan, that they want the world to come to Afghanistan, that they want to open up development and the economy. But again, it becomes very difficult for Western governments or indeed governments around the world, and it becomes very difficult for aid agencies to work with a group which essentially fought a brutal insurgency for 20 years, committing horrific violence against Western forces, against aid agencies who were on the ground helping Afghans, and indeed the Afghan people. And so this challenge remains, but as ever, it's always the most vulnerable who are being affected. Now, the problem is that the most vulnerable people in Afghanistan is now nearly everybody. When the UN says it's the worst humanitarian crisis, they mean it. 95% of people are food insecure, don't have enough to eat. And the Taliban just doesn't have an answer or a solution for any of that.
Yeah, and Imtiaz, as we said at the top, I mean, we're talking about humanitarian crises that are happening in places that you've covered, Syria and Yemen, the DRC, in Ethiopia, in Haiti, right next door to the United States. All of these happening around the world, and yet here we're hearing reports even of young children as young as 9 or 10 years old that are being sold as child brides for families to be able to afford something to eat. So the question becomes, yes, it's difficult for the United States and Western countries to deal in good faith with the Taliban because of this brutal insurgency that they fought for 20 years, but we've done it. We did it most recently in Southeast Asia. And I guess the question is, you don't want children to die needlessly because the United States or her partner allies simply have a disagreement with the Taliban on how they should govern. No one believes that the way that the Taliban governors is the right way to govern people, and you can rightly be against that. But with children dying, with people dying in the streets, and no end in sight, there's gotta be a come to light moment, specifically for the UN. I mean, I listed all these humanitarian crises that are happening. You see UN reports all day long. There was just one that was released today on Ethiopia and the Tigray crisis, but nothing being done about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I would think also, Imtiaz and Vlad, the other part of the challenge is security that you're bringing up, that even if there is a desire to administer the aid, is it safe enough to?
Yeah, huge, enormous questions. And these are questions that need to be answered from President Biden, from the UK Prime Minister, from the 52 countries that were part of the coalition which led that invasion into Afghanistan, who promised Afghans that they would help them, even when leaving. But when we, again, use the UN as an example, they've launched an appeal asking for several $100 million in urgent humanitarian assistance for Afghanistan. They've only been able to raise about a quarter of that money. And this is money that usually, of course, comes from governments saying, hey, look, we want to help out. The UN is obviously best positioned in a country like Afghanistan to distribute and deliver that aid. And the UN will try to sort of, remove itself from any of the political considerations that are going on that might, a country might struggle with. But the fact is that the money hasn't been raised, and the Taliban has been in power now since the middle of August. And it then becomes a question of, well, what is taking so long for these governments? And I always circle back to the Taliban and the Taliban's behavior. Again, women have been excluded from the workforce. Girls aren't going to school. These are basic humanitarian, basic fundamental rights that the Taliban has stripped away almost immediately. And so it then becomes this paradox, if you will, because you have the international community who wants to help, who has the means to help. But at the same time, they don't know how to help a group that, A, they fought for 20 years in the case of the U.S. and some other partners. But more importantly, that this is a group now which isn't dealing in good faith. And so all of this, again, leads back to the people on the ground in Afghanistan who are sitting there and thinking there's no work, There's no money. My children are going hungry every night. Some of them are so sick that they're dying. And suddenly, leaving Afghanistan becomes a pretty real thing for people to do desperately. Now, we looked at people who were able to leave on planes, but Afghanistan is a country that has known war for over 40 years and has seen waves and waves of essentially migration to other countries, whether it's Pakistan to its east or Iran to its west. And indeed, we've seen over the years Afghans streaming into places like Europe. And the concern is that if none of this is dealt with now, that we will see a refugee crisis out of Afghanistan in the millions, where we see people who are leaving this desperate situation and going wherever they can. And suddenly this issue, which at this moment is an Afghan issue with global concerns, then becomes a global issue. But, Anne-Marie,
Imtiaz,
Vlad, as a...
I was just going to add to that point, Imtiaz, and I know we got to wrap this up soon, but it actually offers a welcome respite from the political horse race here in this country. One of the things that you're making a really important point, and you talked about this in the days following the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, the question as to whether or not the Taliban could actually govern, which encompasses feeding its people and providing viable living for them. So could you, and I'm tapping on your experience in Israel and in the West Bank and in Gaza, could we see that vacuum filled by another organization, another group? I mean, just like we saw with the Palestinian Authority and Hamas in Gaza. I mean, once they were not able to provide for those people in the Gaza Strip, another organization, another political party, another group was able to fill that vacuum and has created more problems for the state of Israel and the United States.
Sure, that's the big concern. And Afghanistan, if we want to use that comparison, would be ISIS-K. ISIS-K, of course, is the Afghan affiliate of ISIS, as we know, in Iraq and Syria, that horrific, brutal organization which was militarily defeated, but that ideology still lives. And that ideology is no more present than in Afghanistan, which just yesterday, ISIS-K fighters carried out an attack in Kabul targeting a military hospital, killing at least half a dozen people. And when we use this word vacuum, because again, when people become desperate, they look for somebody to help them, particularly in countries like this, where, you have this sort of, military occupation from the West, who, let's be honest, there were some atrocities committed against the Afghan people in that context, who then turned on that and went to the Taliban to say, hey, these guys aren't going to commit night raids against us, they're not going to drop bombs on us, so we're going to now support the Taliban, which is what we saw in Afghanistan. But now that the Taliban are in power, you then have people who are like, the Taliban aren't protecting us, our kids aren't being fed, they're not going to school. Well, who do we turn to? And the real concern here, as you point out, Vlad, is that ISIS-K may fill that void. And at the moment, ISIS-K is small. It's a threat. They can carry pretty significant violence, but it's not the kind of movement in Afghanistan where it has widespread support. It's still seen as a foreign import. But that could change very, very quickly if all of the many, many, many problems that we've discussed just now aren't solved. And let's be clear, none of the problems have been solved. And so that concern that people, desperate people, looking for help, will turn to an even more extreme group for that help, again, if nothing is done.
Imtiaz, it was really great having you here to talk about this. Politics makes it complicated, but remove politics and it's so clear people are dying. We should be able to do something about that. Imtiaz, I really appreciate your reporting. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, guys.